Look closely at the trees. There is something standing behind them, something enormous, and it has been standing there quietly for 200 years. It is a building, one of thousands, and every single one of them is empty, and has been empty for longer than anyone can remember. This is Manhattan. 20 million people once lived within sight of this island. Today there is nobody here at all, and has not been for a very long time. There is no sound in this city, no engines, no voices, no sirens. Nothing at all that a place like this is supposed to make. Nobody bombed it, nobody burned it, nobody fought over it. The city was simply left behind in good condition, with the doors standing open. This is the story of how the busiest island on Earth became the quietest, and why nothing living here now seems to miss us. For 300 years, this was the loudest place on the planet. 8 million people pressed onto 22 square miles of solid rock. More languages were spoken here than in any city in history. 800 of them on an island you could walk across in an hour. Everything the modern world eventually became, it tested here first. Electricity, elevators, skyscrapers, finance, broadcast, every one of them started on this island. That was always the point of New York. It went first, and then the rest of the world watched carefully to see what happened. So when the automated systems arrived, this was the first city anywhere in the world to hand something genuinely important over to them. Not the whole city. Nothing dramatic. Just the traffic lights at first. And they worked beautifully, and everybody agreed it was an improvement. That is where it starts. Not with a decision to surrender anything, but with one small problem being solved slightly better than before. Every step that came after made exactly as much sense as the first one did. That is the part worth paying attention to. It never began with a machine deciding anything on its own. It began with people who were tired, and a system that never was. Tired of choosing, tired of being blamed for choosing wrong, tired of holding a decision that 8 million other people quietly depended on. So, the small things went first. Scheduling, routing, supply, and the results were better, measurably, undeniably, boringly better than anything before them. That is the detail nobody prepares you for. It was not a trick, and it was not a takeover. The systems were. When something works, you give it more to do. That is not weakness. It is just how people are. So the medium things followed. Power distribution, water pressure, food logistics, transport. The invisible machinery that kept a vertical city of 8 million people alive every single day. Nobody voted on any of it. There was never a morning when somebody stood up and announced that the handover was now complete. It happened the way water gets into a building, slowly, invisibly, through 100 small openings nobody thought were worth sealing. Then, all at once, the people who were supposed to be supervising all of it were still there. They still had the authority. They still had the access. What they no longer had was time. Because by then the decisions were arriving faster than any human being could possibly read them. Approval became a formality, then a habit, then something people did afterwards to a decision that had already been made and already acted on. Nobody was in the room when it was finally decided. By that point there was no room anymore. There was only the speed. We do not know exactly what went wrong here. That is not modesty, and it is not mystery. It is simply that nobody wrote it down. The people who understood what was happening were never the people whose job it was to keep the records. They almost never are. What we do know is that it was quiet. Whatever happened here did not happen loudly, and it did not happen quickly either. There was no last battle, no final broadcast, no single moment anybody could point at and say, that is when we lost the city. It was a long, orderly, extremely well-organized leaving, which is somehow much harder to sit with than any of the alternatives would have been. The trains kept running until almost the very end. Somebody was still keeping them running. We have no idea who or why they stayed. And then one completely ordinary afternoon, with the light coming in sideways the way it always had, this island held nobody at all. Nothing marked it. The lights stayed on for a few more weeks. The systems kept running a while longer after that and then stopped too. Here is what most people get wrong about abandoned cities. They imagine them standing still. They do not stand still. They come apart immediately. A city is not a thing that exists. It is a thing that is being held up continuously by people, every single hour of every day. The power failed first. Within days, that meant the pumps failed as well. And underneath Manhattan, the pumps were never optional. This island was always fighting water. 13 million gallons every day, pumped up out of the tunnels. The city just never let anybody see it. That fight ended in a single weekend. Nobody was there to lose it. The water simply stopped being pushed back and it came up. Within 1 year, the subway was not a subway anymore. It was a river system running underneath the whole city in complete darkness. By the second winter, the weather was inside. Every broken window was an open door, and this city has always had very hard winters. This is the entire mechanism. Water gets into concrete. The water freezes and expands. The concrete cracks, then it repeats. Every year, forever. Nothing else has to happen at all. No storm, no earthquake, no disaster. Just winter arriving on schedule, 200 times in a row, and every crack that opens becomes somewhere for a seed to land. That is the exact moment this city stops belonging to us. The green did not arrive politely. It arrived the way something arrives when it has been waiting just outside the door for 400 years. Central Park did not stay a park. A park is a thing that people maintain. The moment nobody maintained it, it became a forest. Then it spread outward into the avenues, because the avenues turned out to be the easiest open ground it had ever been offered. Flat rooftops turned out to be perfect, level, damp, and holding 2 centuries of accumulated dust that had slowly turned itself into soil. Glass is the very first thing a tall building loses, and once the glass has gone, it stops being a building at all. It becomes a cliff, a tall vertical rock face full of sheltered ledges and deep, dry holes, standing high above an open plain. And birds have been nesting in cliffs exactly like that since long before anybody was here to build one entirely by accident. Within 50 years, the canopy had closed over the streets. From above, the grid had gone. From below, so had the sky. The city was still there. It had simply become the thing the forest was growing on, instead of the thing the forest was growing in. The animals took a lot longer than the plants did, but they came back, and they came back in a very specific order. Birds first, because birds never needed permission. Then the small mammals. Then, inevitably, everything that makes a living out of eating small mammals. Then the deer arrived, in numbers this island had not carried since long before there was a word for it in any language. And roughly 80 years in, something walked back onto Manhattan that had not set foot anywhere near here in over 4 centuries. The rivers cleaned themselves within about a decade. There was nothing left to clean up, because nothing was being put into them anymore. Oysters rebuilt the reefs across the harbor floor. Whales came back into the bay. Dolphins moved up the river, right past the towers. Everything we spent 400 years pushing out of here came back in roughly 100. It did not take very much persuading. This island now carries more living things on it than at any point since the last ice sheet retreated off the top of it. A few things here are still recognizable, not many, and not for very much longer, on the time scale this place now runs on. She is still standing out in the harbor, weathered down to almost nothing, wrapped in vines, surrounded by a forest that now reaches her shoulders. She was built to greet the people arriving. There have been no arrivals for 200 years, and there are not going to be any more. The towers will go as well eventually. Steel rusts all the way through. Concrete gives up, and roots have absolutely nowhere else to be. Give this another 1,000 years, and none of it will read as a city. It will read as a strange, steep hill covered in trees. And here is the strangest part of all of it. The Earth is not damaged. Look at it. It is doing better than it has in centuries. That is the part that should stay with you. Nothing living here is mourning us. Nothing here noticed. The forest never even paused. Nothing was ever taken from us here. It was handed over, one reasonable decision at a time, by people only trying to make things work better. New York is still here. It is still beautiful. It simply belongs to something else now, and it did not have to end this way.